Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, we are just going to dive right into this today by confronting one of the absolute most famous true crime legends of all time. We all know the story, right? The hooded phantom haunting Northern California, sending these cryptic ciphers to newspapers, and just completely terrifying the public. But what if the accepted narrative about this entire case has been fundamentally totally wrong?
Now, I want you to really hold on to that thought, because today we're peeling back the layers of this Hollywood fever dream to look at some incredible new research and theories. I know it sounds completely counterintuitive, but the physical evidence we're going to examine today suggests that the lone mastermind we've all been taught to fear, well, he might actually just be a collaborative fiction. I mean, just listen to this. This terrifying 1969 cipher fragment basically established the boogeyman that held Northern California hostage. When this code was finally cracked, it sent a chill down the spine of the entire nation. It painted this really vivid picture of a remorseless hunter. But, as we're about to see, the physical evidence left at the actual crime scenes tells a vastly different story.
So part 1, the Zodiac Mastermind myth. Pop culture has always painted the Zodiac as this lone mastermind, a military-trained sniper and an evil genius hunting humans for sport.
Imagine reading this over your morning coffee in 1969. It brilliantly illustrates the sheer terror he inflicted, cementing his whole brand as a singular supervillain. The public and the media were, understandably, completely captivated and horrified. But when you actually strip away the sensationalism of these letters and look at the cold, hard forensic reality, the lone serial killer theory begins to face some really serious problems.
Take a look at this. Notice how rapidly and chaotically the methodology shifts across these 4 canonical attacks. The timeline moves from a dark lover's lane shooting to a flashlight ambush, then suddenly to a broad daylight knife attack in a literal costume, and finally to the execution of a cab driver in the middle of a major city. Now, serial killers definitely evolve, sure, but researchers argue that their core behavioral signatures simply do not go through these massive, violent, contradictory changes in such a short window of time.
And looking at the eyewitness accounts side by side, researchers point out some glaring contradictions. I mean, we go from a 195-pound curly-haired man to a massive, lumbering 250-pound giant, leaving deep boot impressions in the dirt, and then suddenly to a 170-pound man with a reddish crew cut. Skeptics of the lone killer theory argue the obvious here. A single man absolutely cannot change his height, his bone structure, and his hair texture so drastically in just 3 months. It just doesn't make sense.
Furthermore, analysts point to the forensic juxtaposition of a panicked amateur spraying bullets in the dark against a brazen daytime knife attacker wearing a homemade executioner's hood. That first attack was sloppy, just a low-power .22 caliber pistol firing wildly into the night with zero recoil control. But then, 7 months later, a man executes this highly complex robbery script in broad daylight with pre-cut plastic clotheslines and a foot-long knife. Honestly, these are entirely different behavioral profiles.
Which brings us to part 2, the prime suspects. So the crucial question becomes, if the profile points to multiple attackers, why on earth did law enforcement focus so heavily on single suspects like Arthur Lee Allen?
Well, on the surface, Allen seemed to perfectly fit the psychological profile. He had all the circumstantial evidence to match the media's narrative. The coincidences are actually staggering. He owned a literal Zodiac brand watch, allegedly spoke of hunting humans with a flashlight taped to his gun, and get this, he had bloody knives in his vehicle. Years later, survivor Mike Majo even picked him out of a photo lineup.
But here is exactly where the case against him totally stalls out. The forensic markers just didn't align. Despite how good of a suspect he was on paper, the hard science tells a totally different story. His DNA didn't match the saliva on the letter stamps, his fingerprints weren't in the victim's cab, and forensic experts definitively ruled out his handwriting. On top of all that, a responding officer who actually saw a suspect walking away from the Presidio crime scene stated Arthur Lee Allen was nearly 100 pounds too heavy to be the guy he saw that night.
Then there's Lawrence Kane. While Kane had a deeply concerning history, including a severe 1962 brain injury and geographic proximity to the victims, he still fails to unify those wildly different physical descriptions across the canonical crimes. Sure, he was picked out of a lineup by Kathleen Johns, a woman who survived a terrifying car ride with a guy claiming to be the Zodiac. But again, he doesn't match the heavy-set description from Lake Berryessa, and just like Allen, there is absolutely zero DNA or fingerprint match tying him to the letters or the cab scene.
Okay, so this is where the story takes a truly fascinating turn. If we have two, or actually maybe even three distinct individuals committing these chaotic acts of violence, who exactly is sitting at a desk, tying them all together with that famous crosshair symbol? Let's dive into part 3, the copycat hoax theory. Online sleuths and researchers like Thomas Henry Horan suggest this triad theory. The idea is that independent crimes were hijacked by an opportunistic letter writer to create a collaborative fiction. The piece of a victim's shirt mailed to newspapers was supposed to be the ultimate proof of identity, right? Yet evidence actually suggests it was likely cut after the body entered the morgue or evidence locker. Just think about this logically for a second. You're in the chaos of a point-blank execution in the middle of San Francisco. Taking the time to precisely cut a massive rectangular swatch of fabric from a bleeding body requires leverage, time, and a sharp cutting tool. Investigators exploring this theory argue that if the shirt was fully intact when the body left the crime scene, well, the whole Mastermind narrative completely falls apart. Proponents of this theory point to a pretty shocking list of insiders. If rogue law enforcement officers or evidence technicians fabricated the letters to manipulate the media, it perfectly explains the impossible knowledge of crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The writer had to have access to unreleased details. Vallejo evidence tech Hal Snook had access to all the reports, and some claim his handwriting heavily resembled the Zodiac's. First responder Richard Hoffman was accused by his own family of sharing the killer's bizarre misspellings. And lead investigator Dave Toschi, he was literally removed from the case in 1978 for forging fake fan letters. So the investigative integrity of the case was, at the very least, deeply, deeply compromised. This entire theory rests on a really stark contrast: the hands committing the bumbling, disorganized violence and the brilliant mind constructing those mathematical ciphers simply do not belong to the same person. The killers spraying bullets in the dark are frantic. The letter writer, though, he's an absolute mastermind of gamesmanship, creating complex 340-character puzzles while pretending to be this unhinged, semi-literate madman. It's heavily argued to be a character being played by someone highly intelligent. So let's look at part 4, the Black Dahlia connection. We're going to take a bizarre turn here into a paradigm-shifting new theory that connects the Zodiac letters to an entirely different, highly infamous murder. In 1970, this incredibly frustrating 13-character cipher was mailed to newspapers, beginning with the phrase, "My name is." For over 50 years, this tiny code drove people crazy because it promised the ultimate answer, but absolutely refused to yield its secrets. But recently, a researcher using artificial intelligence narrowed down millions of combinations to find a 13-character name that perfectly fits the structure and the era's military records. The AI spit out a chilling match: Marvin Merrill. And what's truly unsettling here is that Marvin Merrill was a known alias for a man named Marvin Margolis. By feeding the AI the parameters of the cipher, along with age, location, and military history tied to the Zodiac case, this name bubbled right to the surface. And it just so happens that Margolis is not some random name pulled out of a hat. Researchers point out that Margolis perfectly fits the profile of a trauma-scarred man seeking recognition, and he directly links to the gruesome mutilation of the Black Dahlia 20 years earlier. He was a man with anatomical training and a history of extreme trauma from the Pacific Theater in WWI. He literally lived with Elizabeth Short right before her brutal death, which was a crime famous for its surgical precision. After being questioned by police back then, he changed his name and just vanished. Theories suggest that both the Dahlia killer and the Zodiac shared this intense, borderline obsessive need to control the press and seek media recognition. And get this, a late-life drawing by Margolis features a mutilated woman named Elizabeth, with the word Zodiac allegedly hidden right there in the shading. While skeptics argue we might just be seeing patterns where none exist, which is always a possibility, supporters view this as the private confession of a man who orchestrated the ultimate media-driven terror campaign. Could this really be the final puzzle piece left by a guy who couldn't bear to take his secrets to the grave, but also just couldn't resist playing one last encrypted game? Honestly, we may never officially know the truth. But as this explainer reveals, the source material absolutely forces us to look beyond the Hollywood myth of the lone supervillain and start asking some really uncomfortable questions about the evidence. I mean, if the letters really were a coordinated hoax, or the twisted media game of a man linked to the Black Dahlia, what other legendary true crime narratives have we completely misunderstood? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep looking closely at those details, and I'll catch you next time.